My assumption was that when Reagan left, the Republican Party would spin out of control. What I didn't realize then, or at least what I think now, is that Reagan still runs the Republican Party. It's as if the man never died.
For decades, we have piled deficit upon deficit, mortgaging our future and our children's future for the temporary convenience of the present.
More than 30 years after his inauguration as the 40th President of the United States, Ronald Reagan's vision continues to shape the Republican Party.
In this present crisis, government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem.
He was a stalwart in the conservative movement. He was genial, he was likable, he was popular with the voters.
A Washington outsider, often called the great communicator, Reagan spent more than 2 decades honing his rhetoric against the federal government and communism.
We're at war with the most dangerous enemy that has ever faced mankind in his long climb from the swamp to the stars. And it's been said if we lose that war, and in so doing lose this way of freedom of ours, history will record with the greatest astonishment that those who had the most to lose did the least to prevent its happening. Well, I think it's time we ask...
Ronald Reagan was both a cold warrior and a master diplomat. It's possible to be very, very tough-minded, to believe in peace through strength, as he put it, to believe in power, and to be a good diplomat.
The choices were very obvious, either between big or small government, either between freedom and dictatorship, either between America or the Soviet Union.
We will maintain sufficient strength to prevail if need be, knowing that if we do so, we have the best chance of never having to use that strength.
When people name the figures who were transformative, that is to say, they did more than just occupy the office, but actually changed the direction of the country in some ways, Ronald Reagan would be one of those.
The fact that he was largely successful is allowed the folklore of Reagan to rise to very high proportions in the 21st century. He's seen, like FDR, as a president who was very polarizing in their time, but who has become beloved by the general public.
His whole life had been a series of very improbable things, going from being a radio announcer to a movie star, going from being a movie star to governor of California, going from a failed presidential bid to becoming a very successful president.
Was he a man of simple conviction? Was he a hypocrite who preached his faith in God but never went to church? Was he a man who preached tax cuts but then increased taxes?
On the one hand, he came in talking about fiscal cutting the federal government. On the other hand, he had the largest federal deficits in history in a non-war period.
During the 8 years Ronald Reagan occupied the White House, legislative battles were won and lost. Taxes went down and up. The Cold War neared the end. The War on Terror began. And today, issues battled and fought during the Reagan presidency continue to shape American politics and government.
From a city on a hill to the wondrous generosity of the American people, Ronald Reagan imagined all that. He imagined a history of the United States which wasn't true, and then he made it happen. It was astounding that he could do that.
The farm fields of the Midwest are more than 1,500 miles from Hollywood. Yet to Ronald Reagan, the former actor and governor of California, the heartland was home. Reagan's third campaign for the presidency began with a loss in the Iowa caucus. To win the nomination, he had to defeat Republican Senators Howard Baker and Bob Dole and George H.W. Bush, a former congressman and CIA director who criticized Reagan's economic policies throughout the primaries. Over the years, opponents in both parties had challenged his ideas and his intellect.
The left refused to believe that Reagan was a heavyweight. And so Reagan had the advantage of always exceeding expectations.
He acted president. I don't know whether he knew what he was talking about half of the time, but he was so convincing.
Here was an actor, a former governor, but a former actor. Did he have the gravitas, people asked? Well, it turned out, surprisingly, he did have a lot of gravitas. And people began saying, well, maybe he can be president of the United States.
By 1980, this was a seasoned presidential candidate, a seasoned politician who'd governed the most populous state and who had run against some of the most formidable Republican challengers in the nation.
Ronald Reagan overtook his rivals and accepted the GOP nomination in July 1980.
Thank you very much.
His next task was to challenge the Democratic incumbent, President Jimmy Carter. Two weeks after accepting the nomination, the candidate waded into controversy with his first post-convention speech.
And to restore to states and local communities those functions which properly belong there.
Chills ran up and down my spine when he went to Philadelphia, Mississippi. They could have gone to New Orleans. They could have come to Atlanta. They could have gone almost anywhere in America but Philadelphia, Mississippi, and Memphis.
To many Americans, Philadelphia, Mississippi was a symbol of the civil rights movement and the brutal murder of 3 civil rights workers during the summer of 1964. But Reagan's speech endorsed his belief in states' rights, not civil rights.
As a historian looking at it, I find it to be the low moment of Reagan's political career.
It wasn't an ideal place for a conservative politician to begin his presidential campaign in 1980. There was some symbolism there that was offensive to many Americans.
It was a clear message to the reactionaries and to the racists of America that they were going to be back in charge.
While the speech alienated many African Americans and civil rights proponents, some believe it helped Reagan gain support from Southern conservatives in both parties. Presidential campaigns move quickly, and in his battle with incumbent President Jimmy Carter, Reagan returned to the themes that had propelled him through the primaries.
That Carter record is a litany of despair, of broken promises, of sacred trusts abandoned and forgotten.
Reagan's attacks on Carter focused on a faltering economy, but the crisis that engulfed Carter's presidency played out thousands of miles to the east. Revolution had toppled the regime of the controversial ruler of Iran, Shah Reza Pahlavi. Muslim cleric Ruhollah Khomeini assumed control of the longtime U.S. ally.
As the revolution occurred, the Shah left the country. The U.S. is put in a dilemma, how to deal with its former ally. Originally, the Khomeini government sought to have neutral relations with the United States.
Any hope of neutral relations went out the window quickly. While living in forced exile, the Shah sought treatment for cancer in the U.S. Carter faced one of the toughest decisions of his presidency.
The decision to admit the Shah to the United States for medical treatment
was hugely controversial. We tried to make clear to the Iranians that this was purely humanitarian.
The Shah was allowed to receive medical treatment in New York City. As he recovered from surgery, protesters massed outside his hospital room. But the most powerful opposition played out in Iran, where student militants stormed the U.S. Embassy.
A group of students were marching in front of the American embassy in Tehran when suddenly they ran towards the gate, jumped over the walls, and seized the embassy and its staff. What followed was 444 days of a hostage crisis that gripped the imaginations of all Americans.
Historically, I think it was the first explosion of the new generation of Islamic radicalism.
More radical students on the left conspired to take the U.S. Embassy and the American diplomats there hostage to be able to put pressure on the United States to give up the Shah so that he would have to come back to Iran and stand trial.
The hostages became pawns in the domestic political struggle for Khomeini to consolidate total power for the new regime.
52 Americans were being held hostage, and in the minds of many voters, so was the Carter presidency.
It was a horrible moment for us, but for the whole world of diplomacy, because diplomatic immunity is a fundamental principle that allows an embassy to be in a land where maybe the country is hated.
Carter's approach to the standoff and to the new leadership in Iran generated considerable controversy. Reagan took advantage of the crisis as he pressed voters on pocketbook issues. Gas prices had skyrocketed. The unemployment rate had reached 7.5%. The prime interest rate was above 15%. But the real culprit was what economists called stagflation, the combination of stagnant economic growth combined with high unemployment and inflation.
We don't have inflation because the people are living too well. We have inflation because the government is living too well.
At the White House, months of failed diplomacy with Iran had been scuttled in favor of a military effort called Operation Eagle Claw.
It was my decision to attempt the rescue operation. It was my decision to cancel it.
While prepping the assault team, a crash occurred in the desert. 8 American servicemen were killed, all with no resistance from Iranian forces. When Carter and Reagan squared off in their only televised debate, many pundits suggested that Reagan exceeded expectations.
Are you better off than you were 4 years ago?
Then Governor Reagan offered very simple solutions, both at home and abroad, and this positive kind of upbeat personality, and that's what made the difference.
Americans were more cynical about politics than they were in the 60s, and that was largely because of the intervening period of Watergate and the Nixon administration. But the big problem in the late 70s was inflation, runaway inflation, double-digit inflation, and Americans are worried most of all about their own pocketbooks.
Many voters did not agree with Ronald Reagan's stance on social issues. Gun control, abortion, school prayer. He opposed the Equal Rights Amendment in the 1980 race. But they didn't vote on those issues. Reagan helped reframe the overall political debate in the United States in a way that brought voters who opposed him on those kind of gut social issues to his side.
Jimmy Carter lost to Ronald Reagan by more than 9% in the popular vote. Republicans also gained control of the Senate for the first time in a generation.
The 1980 election was the birth of a new, muscular, self-confident, conservative philosophy which believed in deregulation, lower taxes, less government, and it dominated American politics really for the next 2 or 3 decades.
Inauguration Day for the new president coincided with the release of American hostages.
Even after he was defeated, Jimmy Carter worked overtime right up to the last minute to try to release these hostages. But the hostage takers waited until moments after Ronald Reagan was inaugurated before they finally released the hostages.
The new president never mentioned the hostages in his inaugural speech. Instead, Reagan focused on the themes that would define his domestic policy and approach to government.
Well, if no one among us is capable of governing himself, then who among us has the capacity to govern someone else?
He seized on the old populism, the populism that had emerged in the 19th century in the Midwest. That is, that somebody is screwing us. It's the railroads, it's the banks, it's Wall Street, and it's big business. Ronald Reagan took that American populism and, in a brilliant political maneuver, reversed it, and instead of business being the enemy of ordinary people, government was the enemy, so that he turned the country against government.
Everything about the free enterprise system was good, and everything about government was bad. Of course, he didn't govern that way. He governed with a recognition that government had a role to play. But he mythologized the American free enterprise system.
Faith in government was in question, but the failing economy was not. The challenges were real, and many Americans were hurting.
A lot of people may have been unhappy, but they understood there was an inflation problem. They understood that restraining the money supply was a part of the cure, and I think President Reagan understood that.
While the Federal Reserve battled inflation with high interest rates, President Reagan stuck to the core beliefs that had helped him achieve victory. Less than a month into office, he outlined his recovery plans to Congress, unveiling an approach that came to be called Reaganomics.
I am proposing a comprehensive 4-point program. This plan is aimed at reducing the growth in government spending and taxing, reforming and eliminating regulations which are unnecessary and unproductive or counterproductive, and encouraging a consistent monetary policy aimed at maintaining the value of the currency.
As Congress and the nation debated the merits of the president's plan, a young man from Texas changed the course of history. Just 2 months into office, President Reagan, Press Secretary James Brady, District of Columbia Officer Thomas Delahanty, and Secret Service agent Timothy McCarthy were shot by would-be assassin John Hinckley Jr. 4 people had been seriously wounded.
Roger, we want to go to the emergency room of George Washington. Go to George Washington fast.
The president was conveyed to George Washington University Hospital. His wife, Nancy, arrived quickly, as did the Washington press. As the public would find out later, the president's life was in grave danger. Yet even as doctors prepared for surgery, the president managed to keep the mood light.
Reagan looked up and said, "I hope you're all Republicans." And the doctor, who was a Democrat, actually said, "Today we're all Republicans, Mr. President." I mean, it was the story was right out of Hollywood.
He was a hero in the movies, but now he's a real hero. He survived this attack. And he did it with a style and grace that was uniquely Reagan.
Within 2 days, the press and the world watched as an elderly president began to recover like a man half his age. The stock market rallied, and the president's approval rating rose from 62 to 73%.
It certainly made him a much more difficult adversary for those of us who were trying to really steer the ship a little bit differently.
He gets shot. He survives, and he responds well to it. He's not angry, he's not sad. It really did endear people to him, and it also reassured them.
The White House brilliantly exploited the attempt on his life and his rapid recovery to give him a kind of larger-than-life presence, so that when he returned to Congress to give another speech for his economic program, he was greeted like a conquering hero, and Americans reached out to him.
There are still almost 8 million unemployed.
An invigorated president spelled out the nation's economic challenges, then set a course that would mark his presidency.
The answer to a government that's too big is to stop feeding its growth.
As his initiatives worked their way through Congress, Reagan made history when he followed up on a campaign promise to voters.
It had been 191 years since our country formed, and no woman had served on the court.
I pledge to appoint a woman who meets the very high standards that I demand of all court appointees.
He was very much impressed with Sandra Day O'Connor. She had been a legislator, so she knew the policy world. She had also been an important rancher, so she knew business. And then, most important, she had been a very good judge on the appellate court in Arizona.
I will send to the Senate the nomination of Judge Sandra Day O'Connor of Arizona for confirmation as an Associate Justice of the United States Supreme Court.
It was not a position to which I aspired. I was a Republican. I was presently serving as a judge, and there weren't too many Republican women judges. There weren't too many women judges, period.
We couldn't get the Equal Rights Amendment, we couldn't get equal pay, we couldn't get anything else, but maybe we'll get our nose under the tent.
Sandra Day O'Connor and the president met for just 40 minutes prior to her nomination to the court.
He was very careful to appoint judges that he felt would carry out the constitutional role of a judge. That is, to interpret the law and apply the law, not to make the law.
The president didn't ask me to make any promises about anything.
The nomination was not without controversy. There were objections from some notable conservatives, especially those who viewed O'Connor as moderate on abortion rights.
With this nomination, this administration has in effect said to the pro-family activists, goodbye. We don't need you, we don't want you, we don't care about you.
The subject of abortion is a valid one in my view for legislative action, subject to any constitutional restraints or limitations.
Still, Justice O'Connor's nomination passed the Senate on a unanimous vote.
Where free unions and collective bargaining are forbidden, freedom is lost.
During the presidential campaign, Reagan had declared his support for unions. He also had a history as a union member.
I respect the right of workers in the private sector to strike. Indeed, as president of my own union, I led the first strike ever called by that union.
But when the Professional Air Traffic Controllers Organization, known as PATCO, failed to agree to a new contract with the Federal Aviation Administration, union members decided to strike, and the president reacted.
This morning at 7 a.m., the union representing those who man America's air traffic control facilities called a strike. Government cannot close down the assembly line. It has to provide without interruption the protective services which are government's reason for being.
This issue is bigger than just the threats of the government. Is a much bigger issue to our people. We will not go back to work.
The air traffic controllers had no right to strike. They were a public employee union. Not only did they have no right to strike, but a strike of air traffic controllers was very dangerous for the country. So they essentially dared Ronald Reagan to pull the plug on them and fire them. And what did Ronald Reagan do? he pulled the plug on them and he fired them.
If they do not report for work within 48 hours, they have forfeited their jobs and will be terminated. End of statement.
More than 11,000 union members soon found themselves unemployed.
Many employers interpreted Ronald Reagan's firing of the air traffic controllers as a kind of public license, a kind of public legitimacy to go boldly, dramatically, and publicly after unions in a way that many employers had been reluctant to do before.
It wasn't a notch in Reagan's belt in the sense that that's why he did it. But it was evidence that Reagan would take a position and would stick with it. And that was something that was very good for him as a politician.
The president also stuck to his position on tax cuts. His smile cut through a thick morning fog as he signed the Economic Recovery Tax Act of 1981 in the setting of his California ranch. The new legislation reduced marginal tax rates for individuals by 23% over 3 years.
And this is the tax program. They represent an end to the excessive growth in government bureaucracy and government spending, government taxing.
Crafted by Republican Congressmen Jack Kemp and William Roth, it was the first and most significant tax cut of the Reagan presidency. Roth later remarked, these tax cuts laid the foundation for the longest peacetime expansion in U.S. history.
The tax reduction, people forget this, became bigger than what he proposed, as there was kind of a competition in the Congress. Once we were going to have a tax reduction, the Democrats wanted to get some credit for it too. And that probably helped send interest rates as high as they did, because you had a clash between monetary restriction and growing budget deficits.
Whether tax cuts can stimulate the economy is still being debated. Not everyone in the administration was making that case in October '81, when the White House acknowledged that the United States was in a recession.
The recession of 1981-82 was as deep as the Great Recession that began in 2007-2008. Ronald Reagan essentially said, let the free market do what it will, precisely at a time when typical Americans were starting to struggle harder than they'd ever struggled in the 30 years after the Second World War.
It was a result of the Federal Reserve deciding it had to wring inflation out of the economy, and they raised interest rates up to close to 20%, and that produced very significant unemployment in America.
Unemployment hit 10.8% by the end of 1982, the highest in post-World War II history. The prime interest rate peaked at more than 20%. The recession was more than slight for many Americans.
I had a lot of criticism from the Treasury at that point and from people in the White House, but not from the president himself.
Inflation, high interest rates, and more than 10 million people out of work. The president's tax cuts meant less revenue, and the president initiated decreases to many federal programs in an effort to offset a growing federal deficit. But the president also continued the themes of his inaugural address by asking Congress for increased military spending.
President Reagan had the right idea in terms of scaling the government, but the pain needed to be even-handed.
His military spending was so big that it pumped up the economy, just the way John Maynard Keynes would have suggested pumping up the economy, not because of supply-side tax cuts, but because of government spending.
It truly was military Keynesianism, and Reagan was a true believer in it. And it had the dual purposes of short-term keeping jobs going, but also taking it to the Soviet Union. Reagan was never going to cut any federal program that was going to help win the Cold War.
It's true that the defense budget went up and the non-defense discretionary budget went down, but that had nothing to do with supply-side economics.
But by late 1981, tax revenues and government spending weren't adding up. and what some had called supply-side economics, or trickle-down economics, or simply Reaganomics, was challenged by Reagan's White House budget director, David Stockman.
But we obviously need mid-course corrections.
I knew that David Stockman was a skeptic that the tax cuts would lead to adequate economic growth that would eliminate the deficits. He gave his famous on-the-record interview to a journalist from the Atlantic Monthly, where he basically confessed that the whole Reagan scheme was built on a fiction.
Reporter William Grider quoted Stockman saying, "None of us really understands what's going on with all these numbers." Stockman also referred to the general tax cut as, quote, "a Trojan horse to bring down the top rate." Still, not everyone took Stockman or his claims seriously.
David Stockman meant nothing to Ronald Reagan. He was some smart kid in striped pants, probably called him Dave or Dan in the hall. You know, it's the left who made a big deal out of Stockman when he bolted from Reagan.
There was this internal conflict between some of the extreme supply-siders and folks like Dave Stockman and myself, who believed in lower tax rates and lower government spending, but didn't think that that was going to produce miracles.
The idea was simple enough. Tax cuts would motivate investment and personal spending. Job growth would follow. Revenues would go up, and the budget would balance. Public reaction was mixed.
Reaganomics, I would say, is probably not working.
If you take the highest unemployment since 1929, I would say President Hoover's back in the White House.
It's working for me. I hope it works for other people.
I do feel that we're going to have to bite the bullet a bit, and that maybe it's going to be rough for a little while, but I feel like he's on the right track.
You can see by my shirt that I definitely believe that it's not working.
You have the same arguments now. You know, how much do we spend to boost the economy, which is also going to increase the debt? But tax cuts, Reagan believed, if you're going to increase deficits, tax cuts are the way to do it, not from government spending.
But David Stockman wasn't the only Reagan advisor to suggest that deficits challenged the success of the Reagan strategy.
The political advisors, they knew there was a fiscal deficit, but they didn't want to talk about it, and they didn't want me talking about it. The deficit, as a minimum, means that the government is borrowing funds that could otherwise be borrowed by the private sector and used for investment. So it means less investment. All of the good things that supply-side economics is supposed to be about on the investment side would be crowded out by excessive government borrowing.
Unemployment continued to hover above 10%. Many Americans were desperate. In Milwaukee, more than 15,000 people showed up to apply for just 200 job openings at a local manufacturing plant. The burden of cuts in social services and affordable housing often fell to cities, and some observed dramatic increases in homelessness.
A great civilization, which America is, has to be judged not by its richest, but by its poorest. And in those regards, Reagan seemed callous to this concept of homelessness. Reagan's view is homelessness and welfare, the individual has to take some responsibility for that. The government can't just keep doling out money for people. And if you think that that's cruel, fair enough, but then you have to criticize Bill Clinton too, who simply adopted Reagan's philosophy on welfare.
Statistics on homelessness are difficult to gather. During the 1980s, poverty rates hovered between 13 to 15%. As many as 500,000 people were living on America's streets by the late 1980s.
There were a lot of people hurting during those days. They weren't on Wall Street. They were on Main Street and the side streets of American cities. And poor people, or people without a social safety net, were being hurt by this.
During an ABC News interview, the president suggested that many people were homeless by choice. He added that the problem had been aggravated by issues on the state and local level.
It kind of is blind to those problems that are not solvable by the market, like disabled people or older people or homeless people or children who need education and are marginalized, or people who live in our toughest urban areas and so forth.
Within a year of passing the largest tax cut in American history, Congress and the President weren't able to balance the budget. Shortly before the President signed a tax increase into law, he referred to it as an adjustment.
To even have referred to this as a tax increase, I think was wrong, because it was an adjustment of the tax cut that was passed last year and which still continues on into the coming years.
This thing about Ronald Reagan never raised taxes is ludicrous. He raised taxes when the country needed to have taxes increased.
Human Events, a conservative publication admired by the President, called the, quote, adjustment the largest tax increase in history.
He began raising taxes, though he never used those words. He called it revenue adjustment of the tax cut bill.
What looked like a very affordable tax cut when it was first passed became clear when inflation came down was something we couldn't afford.
By the midterm elections in November, average Americans weren't the only casualties of tough economic times. With President Reagan's approval rating nearing the low point of his presidency, Republicans lost 26 seats in the House of Representatives. Democrats also won 27 of 36 gubernatorial races. Despite the election results, the economy was beginning to show signs of recovery. With inflation under control, borrowing became easier.
Paul Volcker and the Fed merely reversed course. They lowered interest rates, and people could borrow. Companies could borrow cheaply. People could buy more because they could get money cheaply. And that itself boosted the economy enormously.
Volcker had the courage to go through and do that, to push interest rates up to double-digit levels. That brought down the inflation rate much more quickly than anybody expected. And so there was a general recognition that that had been the right policy.
Speaker of the House of Representatives.
As the recovery continued, the President and Democratic House Speaker Tip O'Neill worked on a bipartisan approach to Social Security reform. The result, the Social Security Amendments of 1983, included a significant increase in the FICA payroll tax. It delayed cost of living increases and raised the retirement age from 65 to 67 over 40 years. From the time of the attempt on his life in 1981, First Lady Nancy Reagan had worried about the president's security. As a devoted husband, the decision to run for re-election was a difficult one.
My fellow Americans, it's been nearly 3 years since I first spoke to you from this room.
But for Ronald Reagan, there were many goals yet to achieve.
I am therefore announcing that I am a candidate and will seek re-election to the office I presently hold.
The president began using every tool he had to persuade the American public, including his weekly radio address.
Industrial production has risen 14 straight months. Housing starts climbed 60% in 1983 to the highest level in 4 years. Retail sales surged. Auto sales registered their best year since 1979. And we had the steepest drop in the unemployment rate in more than 30 years.
As he had 4 years earlier, President Reagan seized on pocketbook issues. But this time, he rode a wave of economic news he could take credit for. Consumer confidence was high, and the unemployment rate had dropped nearly 3 points from its peak. Nearly 5 million jobs had been added to the economy. Still, the nation and the world faced significant issues. Reagan's tough stance on the Cold War helped Democrats court the growing anti-nuclear movement. They also seized on a frightening new public health issue. the president had largely downplayed a deadly crisis known as AIDS. Little was known about the disease in 1984, but it was believed to be sexually transmitted. And because the majority of reported victims were homosexual, faulty and sometimes reckless assumptions were made about the disease.
A lot of people died who didn't need to die. I don't think the governmental response was adequate to the problem because it didn't fit within our conception of the kinds of people we ought to be helping. They did this to themselves, their lifestyle, amorality, and so forth. Wrong way to think about this.
Democrats chose San Francisco as the location for their presidential convention, and many gay activists used the opportunity to bring attention to the AIDS crisis. The Democratic platform urged support for AIDS research and treatment, as well as protection from discrimination based on sexual orientation.
Why has this administration failed?
Walter Mondale beat several challengers for the nomination, and Democrats made history by choosing Geraldine Ferraro to share the ticket.
For Vice President of the United States.
The first Reagan years were a lot rougher than people remember. But then when the economy turned in '83 and on into the '84 election, it was clear the president had the upper hand.
The president may have had the upper hand, but Democrats played to his weakness. Since Reagan had assumed the presidency, the federal deficit had more than doubled from $79 billion in 1981 to $185 billion in 1984.
Perhaps the dominant domestic issue of our times is what do we do about these enormous deficits?
Mondale was running against a popular president by this point with no great mistakes under his watch, and with the economy rebounding. The president was light, joked, made fun of his age.
So I will not make age an issue of this campaign. I am not going to exploit for political purposes my opponent's youth and inexperience.
People expected Mondale, a very experienced political leader, meticulous in preparation, to handily win the debates. And he didn't.
Ronald Reagan went on to victory, beating the former vice president in a landslide.
I think that's just been arranged.
Reagan's domestic policy was the impetus for victory, and he played to those themes in his second inaugural address.
Tax rates have been reduced, inflation cut dramatically, and more people are employed than ever before in our history.
With the U.S. economy rebounding and a new leader emerging in the Soviet Union, much of the president's attention in the second term shifted to foreign policy. But there was one group of Americans whose struggles mounted despite the economic recovery.
This country is nothing without the farmer. And those who work the land have the right to know that there's a future in farming.
President Reagan had expressed his appreciation for farmers for years, and agriculture-related industries accounted for a significant portion of the gross national product. But family farmers were facing challenges not seen in a generation, and some viewed the president's messages as mixed. Faced with overproduction, a depressed market, and rising debt, many families pleaded for help to avoid foreclosure on their homes and their farmland.
We have gone further and further downhill until now our net worth is zero minus. We have nothing left that we can call our own.
Our profit picture has disappeared. We're getting a little over $2 and $5 for soybeans, and you just can't make it work.
Yes, we are sympathetic, and we will extend support. But American taxpayers must not be asked to bail out every farmer hopelessly in debt.
Dependence on government loans and subsidies was nothing new, but for this generation of farmers, the foreclosure crisis was. For some, the federal government was their last hope to preserve a lifestyle and legacy that had lasted since the nation's inception.
It's time for others to pitch in and do more. From officials at the state level to banks, private groups, and individuals in our communities, all joining in partnership to help farmers.
Some farmers organized, some fought back. Their protests were heard in Congress and at the White House. Congress and the President allocated $52 billion in aid to the beleaguered farmers, but the long-term impact on traditional family farming was considerable. An estimated 200,000 to 300,000 farm businesses failed between 1980 and 1988. Facing a democratically controlled House, President Reagan embarked on what many consider his greatest bipartisan achievement.
The thing that we did that was most significant, where we were partners, was the 1986 Tax Reform Act that lowered tax rates from 50% to 28% for ordinary income and raised them for capital gains from 20 to 28%. The Tax Reform Act brought Democrats and Republicans together.
Flatter rates will mean more reward for that extra effort, and vanishing loopholes and a minimum tax will mean that everybody and every corporation paid their fair share.
Tax reform didn't necessarily mean more revenue to pay for increased federal deficits, but it did eliminate loopholes, broaden the tax base, and enhance a sense of fairness.
I feel like we've just played the World Series of tax reform, and the American people won.
Immigration, a contentious issue in the 21st century, was addressed by President Reagan just days after the midterm election. The president signed into law a sweeping reform of immigration policy that included amnesty for nearly 3 million undocumented workers.
It's the product of one of the longest and most difficult legislative undertakings in the last 3 Congresses. Further, it's an excellent example of a truly successful bipartisan effort.
I never hear President Reagan's name mentioned in the context of the present immigration debate, in part because I think the right doesn't want to acknowledge that he stood for the last amnesty. It sort of would fuzz the message of President Reagan as the conservative, and the left doesn't want to acknowledge his role because it would confuse things because they're so used to demonizing his policies.
As the former governor of California, the president had firsthand knowledge of the role undocumented workers played in his state's agricultural economy.
He's taking his cues from corporate America. And most business people in the 1980s said we would collapse without the cheap Mexican labor.
Reagan was forward-looking, I think, in terms of legislation, in terms of what he did, because he understood how important immigrants are.
The president recognized that it was in the American interest to have workers here at a time the economy needed them, and he was not driven by any, kind of cultural or anti-Latino vitriol of the kind that we see too often today.
I don't want to make it seem like Reagan's a great champion of Mexican workers' rights. Nevertheless, there was a compassion that he had to people that wanted to come to America for a better way of life.
A better way of life. During his inaugural address nearly 8 years earlier, President Reagan had laid out plans for a renewed America.
It is time for us to realize that we're too great a nation to limit ourselves to small dreams.
Many would agree that he represented hope and that he helped to lift the nation out of the crisis of confidence described by his predecessor, Jimmy Carter.
I think his principal achievement, in a sense, was to change the mood of the country. Coming into office at a time when people were feeling very sour about things, very uncertain.
Whether you agreed with his policies or not, there was a sense the United States was being led in a way that was strong and sure and in essential accordance with our basic principles.
I think sometimes Americans need a framework for understanding what government is doing and where we're going. I happen to disagree with Ronald Reagan's framework, but merely having it was something of an accomplishment.
Like all presidents, Ronald Reagan's domestic policy legacy is complex.
Ronald Reagan spoiled us. He told us we could have our cake and eat it too. I would say that history will say America became a spoiled child under Ronald Reagan. And we're having to pay the price of it now.
Anybody who's fair will tell you the American economy was much better in 88 and 89 than in 81. Hence what Reagan did short term for that generation of Americans was beneficial. What does that mean 100 years from now? Trends that Reagan started? That's why history is an ongoing process.
By the time the president left office, inflation was reduced to 4.7%. The prime interest rate had returned to 11%. Management of the environment under Interior Secretary James Watt was highly contentious, and consensus was never achieved on energy policy. By 1988, more than 82,000 cases of AIDS had been reported in the United States, resulting in more than 46,000 deaths. Military spending increased nearly 35% during Reagan's presidency, and he left behind the largest federal deficit in history up to that time. The president's bipartisan leadership and approach to tax reform was viewed by many as a plus. And for a president who pushed jobs whenever possible, his policies helped reduce the unemployment rate to 5.4%. He lost a Senate battle over Supreme Court nominee Robert Bork, but President Reagan did fill 2 additional Supreme Court vacancies with Antonin Scalia and Anthony Kennedy. Reagan also made 384 appointments to the federal bench, the most of any president in history. Yet as much as Ronald Reagan changed the face of America's domestic policy, many believe his legacy is best articulated by his management of foreign policy.
Negotiation with the Soviet Union must never become appeasement.
What role did the president play in ending the Cold War?
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
How was the Reagan administration impacted by policies in Central America and the Iran-Contra Affair?
I authorized the transfer of small amounts of defensive weapons and spare parts for defensive systems to Iran.
What's the long-term impact of Reagan's decisions in the Middle East?
We didn't have a so-called war on terrorism, but we were fighting it nonetheless.
Must civilization perish in a hail of fiery atoms? Must freedom wither in a quiet, deadening accommodation with totalitarian evil?
I'm scared. I'm scared of nuclear war. I'm scared of my own helplessness.
Where can we go and what can we do and what are we going to grab?
Any second, you know, it could happen, then you just be gone.
I might not wake up because there could be nuclear war.
Someday it could all end.
It's really scary.
By the time Ronald Reagan campaigned for president in 1980, he'd left no gray area in his feelings about communism and the Soviet Union.
Though we should leave no initiative untried in our pursuit of peace, we must be clear-voiced in our resolve to resist any unpeaceful act wherever it may occur. Negotiation with the Soviet Union must never become appeasement.
I think what's important to
recognize is that Reagan did strongly fear the possibility of a nuclear war between the US and the Soviet Union. It wasn't an abstract prospect to him.
Well, this was real, and it was what dominated the maturation of President Reagan from his time in the film industry, when in the post-World War II period, this new threat, ideological as well as military, was on the minds of everyone in America.
There was a very strong sense that war between the two superpowers was a real possibility, and that war in Europe was a real possibility.
He fit very well into the stereotypes and cliches of Soviet propaganda. So, in a way, you could say you could hardly find a better enemy for the Soviet Union.
He didn't feel that he is a warmonger, and once he realizes that fear on the Soviet side is genuine, he wanted to change that.
Every time we had an incident, there were people in the administration who says we have to stop talking to them, and we'll show them. And Reagan would say, no, we don't walk away from negotiating tables.
If there was any epiphany in Reagan's presidency, it was when he got shot and recognized he was living on borrowed time. As any near-death experience does to us, he recognized his hours were being depleted, and he wanted to focus on the love of his life, his wife, and he wanted to focus on being seen as a peacemaker. That would be the epiphany.
We see around us today the marks of our terrible dilemma, predictions of doomsday, anti-nuclear demonstrations, an arms race in which the West must, for its own protection, be an unwilling participant. At the same time, we see totalitarian forces in the world who seek subversion and conflict around the globe to further their barbarous assault on the human spirit.
During Part 2 of the Reagan presidency, we'll look at the administration's role in ending the Cold War. We'll explore the Reagan doctrine in Central America and the impact of the Iran-Contra Affair.
I respectfully decline to answer the question based on my constitutional rights.
And we'll look at the Reagan administration's policies in the Middle East and their impact in the 21st century.
I think that the events in Lebanon brought Hezbollah into our sights for the first time, probably strengthened the Iranian hand in Lebanon, and sent a bad message about what the attack on an American military installation could do to American will.
We think about the period of the Reagan years, the 1980s, as the final decade of the Cold War. That's what Reagan's identified with. But it's also the first decade of what is sometimes called the global war on terror.
If the Soviets do not withdraw their troops immediately from Afghanistan, I would not support the sending of an American team to the Olympics.
I am not frightened by what lies ahead. As for the enemies of freedom, those who are potential adversaries, they will be reminded that peace is the highest aspiration of the American people. We will negotiate for it, sacrifice for it. We will not surrender for it now or ever.
When Ronald Reagan took office on January 20th, 1981, he assumed leadership of one of the two most powerful nations on Earth. The United States and the Soviet Union had been at odds for more than a generation. The Cold War conflict was symbolized by the wall dividing East and West Germany. and global alliances that, with few exceptions, took one side or the other.
It seemed a permanent feature of international politics. We were locked, after all, into this nuclear balance. We were locked into a system, a bipolar system. The Soviet Union had its friends and allies. We had our friends and allies.
The situation was seen as being very dangerous. War was something which people thought of in real terms, not just, oh, theoretically there might be a possibility.
The whole logic of this competition led us to believe that the Cold War was a zero-sum game, that for one to win, the other had to lose.
Germans were vividly aware that if nuclear war was going to happen, a lot of it was going to happen on their territory, which meant partial or complete obliteration of the nation that we lived in. That was a slightly different feeling than growing up, say, in the Midwest.
Reagan, naturally communicating with God, recognized his role was going to be to do away with nuclear weapons, not to increase them. That the key of his presidency was to make the world a safer place, not a more dangerous place.
He wanted to engage them on a moral plane. He felt that too often in détente, which his predecessors had followed, we had been too easy on the Soviet Union and not explained how evil they were.
President Reagan had lived through the 35 years of the Cold War and came to office with a fundamentally different view. He believed détente was wrong.
It's one thing to engage when the engagement is around peaceful coexistence in détente. It's quite another when you've set the terms as an end to Soviet power, and that engagement is toward that outcome.
The president was known for his stern policy against the Soviet Union, but just 3 months into office, Reagan lifted the U.S. grain embargo against the Soviets that had been imposed by former President Carter. The embargo was Carter's response to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, but Reagan felt it was hurting the farmers.
The grain embargo, my quarrel with it from the first was that I thought it was asking only one group of Americans to participate, the farmers.
Grain was crossing borders again, but the two aging leaders were not. Heated rhetoric launched from behind podiums in Washington and Moscow took the place of face-to-face meetings. With the US and NATO planning to deploy 572 new cruise and Pershing II missiles in Western Europe, fear of nuclear war brought more than 250,000 Brits out to protest in London's Hyde Park.
People were quite genuinely afraid of nuclear war. That made for a slightly apocalyptic mood. And that was the mood of much of the student protests against the stationing of the Pershing IIs, the nuclear mid-range missiles, in Europe and Germany.
The United States is prepared to cancel its deployment of Pershing II and ground-launched missiles if the Soviets will dismantle their SS-20, SS-4, and SS-5 missiles.
Not surprisingly, given the mutual mistrust, the Soviets did not agree to Reagan's so-called zero option.
The real weapons are deployed in Europe, and it's so close, and they're clearly directed against the Soviet Union. And in our propaganda, that was, of course, portrayed as purely an aggressive move. We didn't know it was a response to the deployment of SS-20s by the Soviet Union in mid-late 70s in Europe.
Some analysts at the time thought the Soviets had the nuclear advantage. The U.S. deployment, scheduled for late 1983, was seen as part of a large-scale military buildup, a measure reflected in the increased deficit spending in the federal budget. The Cold War was often fought thousands of miles away from the Soviet Union and the United States. Tensions were high in North and South Korea and the Philippines, and proxy wars were being waged in the Middle East, Afghanistan, and Central America. Following the withdrawal of U.S. support for dictator Anastasio Somoza Debayle in Nicaragua, the US and Soviets took opposing sides in what became one of the most defining aspects of Reagan's foreign policy, the Reagan Doctrine.
The Reagan Doctrine basically said that we don't accept that the Soviet Union has a dominant presence in places outside the Soviet Union.
The Reagan Doctrine in Central America was a part of Reagan's overall view that the Soviet Union had to be challenged, and particularly in our own backyard.
In early December, Reagan signed a presidential finding that authorized CIA and clandestine paramilitary support of anti-communist rebels known as Contras.
Of course, we had our efforts in the Eastern European countries, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Poland, and so on. And the same is true in Nicaragua, where the Soviets, through the Cubans, were establishing themselves, or had established themselves. And there was a group of Nicaraguans called the Contras that were opposing, and we supported them.
Estábamos peleando una guerra
We were fighting a war in which the superpowers provided arms and money,
donde las superpotencias ponían las armas y el
and the Central Americans provided the deaths.
ponían los muertos.
The Marxist guerrillas of Central America, the ones in El Salvador as much as the ones in Guatemala, traveled to Cuba all the time, and the Sandinistas were very close to Fidel Castro. And the United States, what they didn't want was a second Marxist-Leninist government, because the Sandinistas had declared themselves Marxist-Leninists.
It seemed to me to be a kind of 1980s version of the domino theory. There wasn't a chance in the world the Sandinistas in Nicaragua were going to come across the Texas border.
Presidente Reagan estaba obsesionado.
President Reagan was simply obsessed with the Contras, and he really wanted to break the Sandinistas.
A los sandinistas. Yo me reunía con
I met with people from the Reagan administration with great frequency.
que venían a verme y me explicaban con mapas cómo
They came to me and explained with maps how the Contras were advancing on Managua, and the reality was something else.
Clandestine support for the Nicaraguan Contras in 1981 soon spread to neighboring countries, and it marked the beginning of longer-term issues that came to plague the administration's policy in Central America. But the Cold War was global. Few parts of the world were spared the conflict. Soviet forces were engaged in a long war for control of Afghanistan, as Afghan Mujahideen battled back using US weapons and support from the CIA. Moscow supported several countries in the Middle East, and protecting America's interests in the region became one of Reagan's greatest challenges.
The Middle East has always been one of the biggest headaches of any modern president, and that's no exception for President Reagan.
If you want to live a life of policy failures, by all means get involved in the Middle East, because it is a horribly frustrating environment.
I believe that the Reagan policy in the Middle East did not make gains, and I would have to say wasted the power of American leadership and diplomacy in the period between June of 1982 and the end of the first term.
For those who draw a close connection between Reagan's Cold War policies and America's role in the Middle East, decisions made during the 1980s are still playing out.
There wasn't much of a policy that was directed towards the region on the basis of the region itself. We were just looking at the success when it came to the US's relationship with the Soviet Union. But much of the problems that we have till this day in the region were born out of policies that either were put into place during Reagan or were continued during the Reagan years.
Weighing Cold War objectives with long-simmering regional disputes created more than a few strange bedfellows.
American interest in Iran stemmed from two matters primarily. First of all, it is a source of energy production, oil. It is also on the Persian Gulf, and in terms of Cold War issues, a site that was within plausible reach of the Soviet Union to establish presence on the Persian Gulf.
Iran was without a Cold War ally and was still rebuilding from its own revolution when Saddam Hussein and Iraq invaded Iran's oil-rich south.
The Iranian army and military was essentially in shambles. Most of its weaponry was American-built, and without the spare parts, it was at a standstill.
Though the Soviets had a history of dealing arms to Iraq, the U.S. also opted to aid Iraq in what became an 8-year war between Iraq and Iran. The move threatened America's closest ally in the region, Israel.
Iraq, from the Israeli perspective, was a primary enemy. The US government is moving increasingly closer to the Saddam Hussein government in Iraq. This is a nightmare scenario for Israel. Israel views Saddam's Iraq as an existential threat. And there was a sense that Iran needed to be helped in order to ensure that it would not lose the war against Iraq.
With the 1979 embassy takeover still fresh on the minds of most Americans, closer ties with Iran were unthinkable. But the civil war in Lebanon called for immediate attention.
By 1982, southern Lebanon had become essentially the staging ground for the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO. It was from southern Lebanon that the PLO was launching rockets into northern Israel.
As in many other civil wars that take place in smaller countries, it very quickly turns into an arena for great powers to fight their own proxy wars, and Lebanon was no different.
Lebanon had been locked in a civil war for most of the previous 7 years. Israel and Syria had taken sides in the battle, as had Yasser Arafat and forces from the PLO. The US, Soviets, and Iran tried to influence the outcome through a mix of diplomacy and alliances of their own. As Reagan visited Europe for the first time during his presidency, Israel, in response to missile attacks fired against them from Lebanon, mounted an invasion force of its own. With Lebanese Christians as allies, 70,000 Israeli troops led by Defense Minister Ariel Sharon crossed the border in an effort to neutralize the PLO. Just 2 days later, Ronald Reagan became the first American president to address both houses of the British Parliament.
Speaking for all Americans, I want to say how very much at home we feel in your house.
The speech demonstrated a sharp turn away from policies of détente.
What I'm describing now is a plan and a hope for the long term. The march of freedom and democracy, which will leave Marxism, Leninism on the ash heap of history as it has left other tyrannies which stifle the freedom and muzzle the self-expression of the people.
It was in that speech where he really laid out his belief that communism as a system was doomed to end up on the ash heap of history. I think it sent a signal to the Soviet Union and to the rest of the world that Reagan was not a president who was just going to be happy with the status quo.
Words meant something to Reagan. It wasn't a game. It was ultimately for telling the truth as you saw it, as best you could see it.
In that incredibly strong rhetoric, he was setting new terms for the US-Soviet relationship. That we were right in our values, the Soviet Union was wrong in its values. This was not going to be peaceful coexistence. This wasn't going to be détente. This was going to be the triumph of freedom.
Ronald Reagan was representing the extreme part of the American conservative ruling elite somewhere in the gray zone between the hardline conservatives and what the Soviet propaganda didn't hesitate to qualify as fascist.
Public reaction in the U.S. was mixed, and millions of Americans favored a nuclear freeze.
The people, united, will never be defeated.
Nuclear fear escalated in Europe as NATO allies faced crises around the world.
In the summer of 1982, the economy was plunging. Argentina seizing the Falkland Islands from Britain, and so Britain was going to go to war against Argentina. And then Israel invaded Lebanon, and Reagan had this series of crises on his plate. He made the fateful decision to try and stabilize the situation and encourage Israel to withdraw from Lebanon by introducing American troops into Lebanon.
With Israel, Syria, and the PLO already engaged in Lebanon's civil war, the U.S. joined France and Italy as part of a multinational peacekeeping force.
The goal in '82 was to negotiate the withdrawal of both Israeli and Syrian forces with the larger goal of restoring an independent Lebanon. To do that, of course, you needed internal stability in Lebanon.
Under a U.S. negotiated settlement, Yasser Arafat and the PLO fighters responsible for shelling Israel agreed to leave their camps in Beirut. But neither Syria nor Israel seemed clearly aligned with U.S. goals. The strongest Israeli alliance on the front was between Ariel Sharon and newly elected Lebanese President Bashir Gemayel of the Christian Phalangist Party.
We now know that Gemayel and Sharon, who had a close relationship, that there was an understanding between them. Sharon was determined, and he was very powerful in this whole equation, and he had convinced Begin, we've really got to take care of this mess up there. We've got to do it right.
The PLO encampments, which still housed thousands of Palestinian refugees, were surrounded by Christian Phalangist forces.
Sharon had really never believed that there weren't a whole lot of underground fighters left in the camps. So he had an understanding with Gemayel that once Arafat and his boys are gone, if there's any trouble with these camps, you'll take care of it.
The crisis worsened when Gemayel was assassinated, his Christian Phalangist Party headquarters destroyed.
Suddenly the new president is no longer there, and the Phalangist leadership carries through on their understanding that we'll take care of the Palestinians.
After the assassination of Gemayel, the Christian Phalangist forces went into a rage. They wanted to enact revenge for this assassination. They went into two refugee camps, Shabra and Shatila, and while the Israeli army encircled those camps, took part in one of the most horrific massacres of that war.
The rage led to the slaughter of Palestinian women, children. With acquiescence of the Israeli government, they could have prevented it. It had a searing effect within the Reagan presidency.
Millions of us have seen pictures of the Palestinian victims of this tragedy. There's little that words can add, but there are actions we can and must take to bring that nightmare to an end.
The number of victims is disputed, but some estimates suggest that thousands of unarmed civilians were killed. U.S. forces played no role in the massacre, but some factions in the long-simmering Middle East conflict held the U.S. accountable based on its ongoing support of Israel and the government of Menachem Begin.
President Reagan saw a need to stress to the Begin government the sense of outrage that he felt, and to say in a very pointed round of discussions with Begin that this could lead to a fundamental review of the United States relationship with Israel.
For the United States to be seen as the ally that permitted or perceived to have permitted this massacre obviously did a tremendous amount of damage to America's standing in the region.
We all blame Sharon for having misled Begin, and I'm not sure how much of that is relevant. Clearly, Begin was not the author of these massacres. I'm not sure he was all that unhappy about them either.
The international backlash was significant, and the massacre had a profound impact within Israel. During the months following the massacre, an internal Israeli investigation called the Kahan Commission determined that Israel was indirectly responsible for the massacre. The commission also declared that Defense Minister Ariel Sharon bore personal responsibility for failure to prevent the attacks. The massacre inspired significant consequences within Lebanon, including the growth of Hezbollah.
The Iranian government played an instrumental role in bringing various Shiite factions together and form Hezbollah, which means the party of God.
And the Syrians were party to it and agreed to the Iranians using Syria as a conduit for both weapons and also leadership and training and emissaries and the rest.
Yes, Hezbollah is born out of that because it fills the vacuum that is there. It gained strength from the Iranian Revolution, which of course was just 3 years earlier. It gained strength from the sense that the United States will not resist in the Middle East.
Russian leader Leonid Brezhnev died in office before he and Reagan could even agree to meet. He was replaced by Yuri Andropov, the longtime head of the KGB, the Soviet equivalent of the CIA. In Washington, Democratic lawmakers remained focused on Reagan's policies in Central America. Under a national security decision directive signed by the president, the U.S. was spending millions to recruit and train Contra forces in Nicaragua. Democrat Edward Boland, chairman of the House Select Committee on Intelligence, engineered passage of a series of restrictive amendments prohibiting the use of U.S. government funding in support of military or paramilitary operations in Nicaragua.
The Boland Amendment said if an administration, any administration, wishes to use public funds to conduct military operations, it must be approved by the Congress of the United States. And that's simply required by the Constitution.
Yes, let us pray for the
Soviet threat in Central America was debatable, but the president's feelings about Moscow and the Eastern Bloc were not.
But until they do, let us be aware that while they preach the supremacy of the state, declare its omnipotence over individual man, and predict its eventual domination of all peoples on the earth, they are the focus of evil in the modern world.
Any country that has a government that allows its leader to kill over 20 million people, which Stalin did, is certainly not benign. It's not even neutral. It's evil.
The convictions were that for all its faults, America was good. For whatever it may have accomplished in improving its living standards, the Soviet Union was evil. And that conviction was immovable.
We were so desperate to have some semblance of normal relations with the countries in our neighborhood that we blinded ourselves to how bad these regimes were. Evil empire at the time struck us all as a willfully outrageous way of describing the Soviet Union. In retrospect, yes, it was. It was pretty evil, and so was East Germany.
You're not allowed to read a Bible. You're not allowed to go to church. You're not allowed to have freedom of speech. You live in constant fear. You know, what's there to admire about a country of thuggery like that? And so Reagan understood that and always had the moral high ground.
This is why I'm speaking to you tonight, to urge you to tell your senators and congressmen that you know we must continue to restore our military strength.
With his approval rating near its all-time low, President Reagan used a nationally televised speech to announce what the administration termed a strategic defense initiative.
What if free people could live secure in the knowledge that their security did not rest upon the threat of instant U.S. retaliation to deter a Soviet attack, that we could intercept and destroy strategic ballistic missiles before they reached our own soil or that of our allies?
The idea of using space-based defense systems to shoot down nuclear missiles before they could reach their target was a bold step.
What do we do best? What would leverage our economic potential to where when we spend $1, they have to spend $2 on the other side, or 3 or 5?
Whether defense would work, the missile defense program, was yet to be determined. But the United States under Reagan was going to be very busy on the technology side in engaging the Soviet Union in a technology race that it had never quite seen before.
Many questioned whether the so-called Star Wars project was technically possible, or was it economic warfare?
So where were we? We were at a point where the Soviet Union had about 3 times as many land-based warheads, first strike warheads, as we did. Now, if you can't get them to unilaterally reduce, and you can't get our side to deploy the MX missile, what can you do to account for the risk you're running by this 3-to-1 advantage in a first strike system? Well, the kind of obvious answer is you catch all those. You prevent them from ever reaching your side with defense. Well, that's easy to say and not necessarily feasible.
It was interpreted on the Soviet side like an intention to, yes, protect the United States, to build for themselves a defensive shield, but with one obvious purpose: to be secure in the situation of a first strike directed against the Soviet Union.
The assumption on the part of many, particularly their military, that this was a strategy to make a first strike possible. In other words, we would put up a defense that would protect us, and then we would attack them, and they would have no deterrent to keep us from attacking.
It was seen as capable of genuinely destabilizing the balance of mutual assured destruction. It would give the Americans a supremacy, potentially, that we thought the Soviets might feel they had to react to with a preemptive nuclear strike, and guess where that would land? Not good.
Robert McFarlane was among the architects of SDI, but he and the president held slightly different views of the SDI program.
Yes, it's a military system, but its impact is economic. Impose such a burden on the Soviet economy that it simply cannot bear it by investing in what we do best, high technology. Well, I don't want to mislead you. That wasn't President Reagan's motive. He wanted to build it.
The Soviet economy was compromised by more than just the arms race. Many in the administration believed the Soviet war in Afghanistan was taking its toll.
The country is stagnating. There is a growing understanding that change will have to come, even at the highest level and in the population, that we simply cannot live like this any longer.
At the end of the day, the Soviets committed their own mistake by going into Afghanistan, getting themselves tied down there, and then bleeding to death in that country.
The Reagan administration support for Afghanistan's so-called freedom fighters never involved American troops. Lebanon was a different story, and the consequences for the U.S. escalated when a 2,000-pound suicide car bomb exploded in front of the American embassy in Beirut.
This criminal attack on a diplomatic establishment will not deter us from our goals of peace in the region. We will do what we know to be right.
63 people were killed, including 17 Americans, 8 of whom worked for the CIA.
El Salvador is nearer to Texas than Texas is to Massachusetts.
As the Cold War played out with a clearly marked agenda in Nicaragua and El Salvador, the president, in one of his least persuasive roles, pleaded with Congress to fund the Contras.
If we cannot defend ourselves there, we cannot expect to prevail elsewhere.
There were lots of Democrats in the Congress who felt that we shouldn't be supporting the Contras even rhetorically. So there's a difference of opinion. And they denied funding for what we wanted to do.
He believed he was doing good in Central America. He believed that these thugs we were paying were freedom fighters. I mean, it was a total folly. And the fact that he made so many speeches and statements about it compared to what the historical importance of it is, which is pretty close to zero, he thought he was doing the right thing.
No era un poco exagerado llamarlos freedom fighters.
It was a bit exaggerated to call them freedom fighters.
Él estaba apoyándolos y creía.
But certainly he was supporting them, and they believed it.
Y fue casualmente mi.
And it became my mission that the triumph would not happen militarily.
At the Kremlin, the Soviets were still pondering the idea of weapons in space, as well as the toll it might take on the Soviet economy.
Throughout 1983, you have discussions about how can we respond. It was taken absolutely seriously. How do we respond? There has to be a response. Well, we can't afford the same technology. We have to come up with an asymmetric response.
Many of the Soviets didn't think it would work, but they couldn't take a chance. It might work. The Americans come up with wild stuff all the time. What if they come up with a defensive system?
A lot of military, now they write in their memoirs and in interviews, oh, we knew it was not doable. We knew it was, we knew. But at the time, this is not how they responded. They said, threat serious, they're ready. This is how, unfortunately, Andropov thought. And there's a lot of evidence indicating that he seriously was afraid of SDI. Seriously.
In a June 22nd letter to Reagan, Soviet leader Yuri Andropov suggested the two countries focus on, quote, the elimination of the nuclear threat. Though the pitch was reminiscent of Reagan's zero-option proposal, the letter did not provoke a significant response from the White House. Rhetorical games between the US and the Soviet Union had a long history, but the real risk of nuclear war had rarely been greater. It escalated to a tipping point on September 1st, 1983. "269 people were killed when a Soviet fighter jet shot down a civilian passenger jet, Korean Airlines Flight 007. The jet was off course and in Soviet airspace, but the downing was viewed as an act of aggression against the United States, South Korea, and its allies.
It was a horror, and we led the charge against them for that on a world basis.
The fact is that they did recover the black box. They had no evidence ever that this was a spy plane. Even the communications by the fighter pilot, who said that he could see the plane, the strobes were flashing. Now, a spy plane doesn't flash strobes. A passenger plane does.
The choices that both sides made were Cold War choices. But the decision was made to say this is an act of absolute evil. And on the Soviet side, they decided to cover up. And that just immediately erased any remnants of trust. We have the Politburo document where they make decision to cover up. And of course, as everything in the Politburo, it's unanimous.
The Soviets admitted shooting down what they claimed was a spy plane.
This was the Soviet Union against the world and the moral precepts which guide human relations among people everywhere. It was an act of barbarism.
The president was hailed by many for his strong rhetoric. And while the incident sparked protests and increased tension, it did not provoke military action.
Let's be realistic. The United States and the Soviet Union were in death grip of nuclear forces aimed at one another. Our most important and most capable military forces aimed at each other across the Fulda Gap in Europe, armed to the teeth across the world. I doubt that there was ever real serious consideration to war with the Soviet Union.
War between superpowers was averted, but the civil war in Lebanon continued. U.S. forces remained on the sidelines as Reagan's national security team battled inside the White House.
There was a serious, sharp division in the administration between the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense. Secretary Weinberger disagreed quite emphatically with allowing the Marines to become involved in any kind of combat in Lebanon. He believed that our larger interests in the Middle East were oil and in maintaining good ties with the producers of oil in Saudi Arabia and beyond.
The leaders of Hezbollah had their own agenda. Just 6 months after bombing the U.S. Embassy, terrorists struck again at the heart of the multinational peacekeeping force. 241 American servicemen were killed when a suicide bomber drove a truck loaded with explosives into their barracks. Moments later, a second coordinated attack killed 58 French soldiers from the same multinational force.
If Lebanon ends up under the tyranny of forces hostile to the West, not only will our strategic position in the Eastern Mediterranean be threatened, but also the stability of the entire Middle East, including the vast resource areas of the Arabian Peninsula.
The motivation for Hezbollah's attack on the U.S. Embassy and then again on the Marine barracks was quite clear. They did not want to see the United States create a permanent presence in southern Lebanon.
The deaths of Americans at the U.S. Embassy and in the military barracks in Beirut was a generalized turning point in which the Americans realized that they were not only engaged in a Cold War with the Russians, but also in a war on terror in the Middle East.
Is it the global war on terror? Is it the long war? I think Lebanon really speaks to the difficulty that Reagan faced with those fundamental questions of having a global conflict of a nature that's different than anything that he had been preparing for in the Cold War fight.
That moment, I think, was the first time in which most Americans understood that a new enemy was on the horizon. That the wars of the next century were not going to be between nation states, but between superpowers and these small terrorist organizations.
The violent attack and murder of 241 Marines in their barracks in Lebanon was a devastating blow to the American psyche and a blow to American self-confidence. Americans did not want military forces in that part of the world, especially when it was clear that they were creating more instability and not stabilizing the situation. They were a toxic outside element.
If there's anything that happened in the Reagan administration that I second-guess myself and everybody else on, it's that operation in Lebanon. I'm a Marine, so it particularly hit me hard. It hit everybody hard. I would say that was the worst day of the Reagan administration.
President Reagan decided that the situation was too dangerous, but he never called it a withdrawal or a retreat. He said merely that the Marines or the U.S. forces would remain in the area, but they would redeploy to ships offshore.
Our mission, I think, makes sense.
The long-term impact of the president's decision to withdraw forces remains controversial.
We're going to make every effort we can to minimize the risk, but also to find those responsible.
For the United States not to respond, not to impose a cost whenever Americans were killed anywhere, had the effect of stimulating a conclusion on the part of Iran at the time and Sunni terrorists, Al-Qaeda ultimately, that attacking Americans was cost-free. It was a foreshadowing of what has become today a very, very serious global threat.
We didn't have a so-called war on terrorism, but we were fighting it nonetheless with much less in the way of weapons. So I guess you could say that's a precursor of what's going on today with different tools.
It represented a decade of a radical shift in American thinking about what was the core challenge in the international system.
That, when I think about it, is probably the one example in the Reagan administration that perhaps looking back on it, they might have done differently. It set off then, I think, a whole series of events in Lebanon and in the Middle East that we probably ultimately paid for in terrorism's forward march until we finally had to confront it after September 11th.
Bodies were still being counted in Lebanon when the president used National Security Decision Directive 110 to authorize a second simultaneous mission in the Caribbean. A U.S. Navy carrier task group bound for Lebanon was diverted to battle in one of the smallest countries in the Western Hemisphere, a former British colony called Grenada. Just slightly larger than Martha's Vineyard, most journalists couldn't find Grenada on a map. But that made little difference, since the military, in an unprecedented move, prohibited journalists from documenting the conflict.
Early this morning, forces from 6 Caribbean democracies and the United States began a landing or landings on the island of Grenada in the Eastern Caribbean.
Grenada was a strange enterprise, frankly. I don't think there was ever any doubt that the United States of America was going to defeat Grenada.
To observers of the Reagan doctrine playing out in Central America, the invasion of Grenada may have seemed obvious.
Reagan was beginning to develop policies that would take the United States away from this notion of Vietnam, we do nothing at all, because we can't win.
The invasion was authorized with the support of some members of the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, though their vote was not unanimous. Maurice Bishop, the self-imposed Grenadan leader, had been executed in a coup during the week prior to the U.S. invasion. But it was unclear whether U.S. citizens on the island were in danger. There was a general sense that the raid was intended to minimize Cuban influence on the tiny island. The Cubans were clearly playing a role in the construction of a new airport, but so were contractors from England, Canada, and Finland.
The United States objectives are clear: to protect our own citizens, to facilitate the evacuation of those who want to leave, and to help in the restoration of democratic institutions in Grenada.
Hundreds of journalists gathered in nearby Barbados, but they were not allowed into Grenada. Americans and Congress were left searching for answers. Are we looking for a war we can win? Asked Florida Senator Lawton Chiles. If American citizens were not in danger, how can we justify the invasion? Asked presidential candidate Walter Mondale. Nearly 8,000 American forces participated in a war that was over in just a few days. Thousands of miles from Grenada, West Germany geared up for winter and for the deployment of more than 100 U.S. Pershing II ballistic missiles. But the coldest spot in Europe was a negotiating table in Geneva.
The present round of the negotiations is discontinued without any date set for their resumption.
For the first time in more than 20 years, Soviet diplomats walked away in defiance. Nicaragua, El Salvador, Iran, Lebanon, Grenada, Afghanistan, Europe, the Soviet Union. few parts of the world were safe from the Cold War.
I am therefore announcing that I am a candidate and will seek re-election to the office I presently hold.
As the president announced his bid for re-election, many voters hoped that his stated appetite for peace would soon be satisfied. A Gallup poll taken shortly after his announcement showed that 49% of Americans disapproved of his handling of foreign policy. Only 38% approved. With Time magazine's provocative Men of the Year issue still circulating, Soviet leader Yuri Andropov died of kidney failure.
Reagan writes into his diaries, how can I talk to them if they keep dying on me? So you have Brezhnev dying in November 1982. Andropov comes in, very quickly becomes very sick. Andropov was really hoping that Gorbachev would be his replacement. But because of the political intrigue within the Politburo, Chernenko becomes Andropov's successor. So there is no possibility of dialogue. We were not aware that Reagan was trying to engage them.
Considering the intensity of the Cold War and the international fear of nuclear conflict, one American's disappearance in Lebanon may not have seemed newsworthy. But the March kidnapping of William Buckley, the CIA station chief in Beirut, escalated the stakes between Iranian-backed Hezbollah and the United States. The kidnapping became a catalyst for a new clandestine discussion involving the US, Israel, and Iran. The outcome would lead to profound implications for the Reagan presidency and a long-term impact on America's policies in the Middle East.
We thank the citizens of the United
As the president campaigned for a second term, CIA involvement in Nicaragua was cloaked in secrecy. The same was true of administration efforts to bypass Congress with offshore funding for the Contras. But the president's convictions remained strong.
Our policy is simple. We are not going to betray our friends, reward the enemies of freedom, or permit fear and retreat to become American policies, especially in this hemisphere.
Ronald Reagan understood the strategic value that Iran gave the United States with regard to the Cold War. Iran was in many ways the final frontier between the West and the Soviet Union.
Ronald Reagan had entered office as a Cold Warrior with a focused anti-Soviet agenda. But with civil war in Lebanon, the emergence of Hezbollah, terrorist attacks on the military, and the kidnapping of American citizens, the world he faced while seeking re-election presented new challenges. Battles and covert operations continued in Central America without the support of Congress. New leadership emerged in the Soviet Union, and with it, a sense of hope not seen in decades. And Iran, long a nemesis for the Reagan team, dealt the administration a near fatal blow in what became known as the Iran-Contra Affair.
It's so murky. Still, after all of the investigations of it, the Tower Commission report and all, it's still pretty murky that the selling of arms through Israel to Iran, right, that part of it. But then the diversion of the funding to the Contras, that clearly was not a part of the policy.
Those stories and more in Part 3 of The Reagan Presidency.
I think that's just been arranged.
With a landslide victory paving the way for his second term, the president took office reiterating his support of the anti-Marxist rebels known as Contras.
We must not break faith with those who are risking their lives on every continent from Afghanistan to Nicaragua to defy Soviet-supported aggression and secure rights which have been ours from birth.
Congress had passed the Boland Amendments to deny U.S. funding of the Contras. But the president and his team took their search for funding offshore.
You cannot establish confidence in your allies, in this case the Contras in Nicaragua, if you obviously aren't able to say with confidence that we're going to be able to continue our support next year and the year after and the year after.
The Cold War was driven by secrets. Skirting the Boland Amendments with offshore financing was no exception. Later investigations revealed that Saudi Arabia alone provided more than $30 million in Contra funding. With proxy wars in Central America and Afghanistan, strategic challenges in the Middle East, and U.S. missile deployment ramped up in Western Europe, relations between superpowers had rarely been worse. As those in the White House considered their options, Ronald Reagan could not have known that his partner for change, real change, was waiting in the wings of the Politburo. After an unremarkable 13 months as General Secretary, Konstantin Chernenko died. His successor, 54-year-old Mikhail Gorbachev, assumed office as the youngest Soviet leader in more than 3 decades.
Brezhnev died, Andropov died, Chernenko died, and then finally you get Gorbachev.
People saw in Mikhail Gorbachev a much more moderate reformer and somebody who I think a lot of West Europeans felt was someone that they could live with.
When it became clear that Gorbachev actually wanted reform, that was the first glimmer of hope for Europe in many decades.
Gorbachev was a sensation. He was young. He looked healthy. He moved.
The main feature for Gorbachev was not only absurdity, but actually impossibility of the nuclear war. So that meant for Gorbachev that this kind of war, in any case, not only could not be won, but could not be fought.
The Soviet Union had to come to a particular place in its own history where it was vulnerable to an American push to roll it back. Mikhail Gorbachev is a part of that story because he thought he could reform the Soviet Union.
Gorbachev is formidable because if he didn't have a new type of Soviet leader ready to do business, I'm not sure Reagan's charm would have overwhelmed them.
You know, his speech sounded to us then so sophisticated. Like, he was a Moscow University graduate. We felt, wow. But the style changed, and there was this feeling of fresh blood. Oh my God, he can talk. That's what we told each other. He answers questions. He reacts. He thinks.
World events continued to unfold in dynamic fashion. Anti-Soviet unrest in Poland, a sympathetic ally in the Vatican, the fight to end apartheid in South Africa, famine in Ethiopia, a controversial dictator in the Philippines, terrorist attacks on cruise ships and airliners. With the emergence of Gorbachev, the president's foreign policy focus narrowed. At the same time, black and white policies in Central America and the Middle East began to gray in what would soon be called the Iran-Contra Affair.
And there was one major scandal that had the potential to destroy the Reagan presidency. It was Iran-Contra.
The kidnapping of William Buckley in Lebanon was, by now, one among several. It became a catalyst for action.
And the president, in a very human way, felt, I'm the president. These are Americans. They're being held against their will, probably tortured, and I should be able to do something about it.
In the chaos of Lebanon, Hezbollah used the hostages to build its own base of power.
The United States has CIA agents and assets in the country. Hezbollah is beginning to kidnap many of these individuals for ransom It shows the costliness of being involved in the Middle East. But it quickly then gets elevated to a very, very high level of politics, in which the Iranian government is utilizing some of these Americans in order to put pressure on the United States.
Where some saw complications, others saw opportunity. Iran wasn't faring well in its war with Iraq, and they needed American weapons. At the same time, Iran had influence over Hezbollah in Lebanon.
So when somebody came along and said, well, Mr. President, we might have a big change in our relations with Iran, and if we sell them some arms, that would help do it. And by the way, Mr. President, we also get our hostages back. That hit him in the gut.
Ronald Reagan understood that only Iran could control Hezbollah. The hope was that in selling arms to Iran in the midst of this devastating war between Iran and Iraq, that he would be able to free the American hostages being held by Hezbollah.
The idea was originally an Israeli idea, that there was a need for the United States to sell arms to the Iranians, make sure that the Iranians were not defeated. In return, the Iranians would give up American hostages in Lebanon.
So the president, the vice president, Bill Casey, the DCI, and the chief of staff, Don Regan, and I, in the beginning, said we ought to determine whether or not what Israel is saying is true.
Among the challenges facing the administration was its own stated policy. Neither the U.S. nor its allies were allowed to sell weapons to a terrorist-sponsoring nation. In this case, Iran. There were many agendas at play. Most were in conflict. The U.S. wanted its hostages released from Lebanon. Iran wanted American weapons to battle Iraq. Israel and the U.S. both wanted regime change in Iran.
The end objective was to find a way to bring back, and these are the words of Shimon Peres in a letter that he wrote to Ronald Reagan in 1986, bring back Iran into a broader strategic relationship with the West.
It was not such a crazy idea if you start with the right premise. Premise being that there really is a possibility of changing the nature of this regime enough so we can have some parallel interests. And to do so, you use weapons because that's something they need and we've got.
From our point of view, to be able to trust that they had some influence and the ability to serve our interest, they had to be able to demonstrate that by releasing hostages. And that scenario was to have involved one shipment and all the hostages.
Between August and September of 1985, Israel shipped more than 500 anti-tank missiles to Iran on behalf of the United States. Of the 7 hostages in captivity in Lebanon, a Presbyterian pastor named Benjamin Weir was the only one initially released.
It soon became evident in September, after that shipment was made and one hostage was released, there was bad faith.
The consequences grew when news broke that American hostage William Buckley was dead. An Iranian-backed organization called Islamic Jihad reported that the CIA operative had been executed while in captivity. Later reports said Buckley had died months earlier from torture and poor medical care. Buckley's death had an impact, but it didn't stop the transfer of weapons and funds. Beyond the White House and partners in Israel and Iran, the operation was still secret, and repercussions of the murky deal were months away. Throughout his presidency, huge crowds had gathered to protest Reagan's nuclear policies.
In dealing with the peace movement, Reagan was quite different from, say, the Nixon reaction during the war in Vietnam.
I believe he thought, I agree with them. Let's get rid of nuclear weapons. but let's do it in a way that protects our national interest. So I think he agreed with the goal.
They may have shared the goal of a nuclear-free world, but not the path toward achieving it. With Gorbachev as a partner, things were about to change.
Good evening. This is Ronald Reagan, President of the United States, speaking to you from Washington about my upcoming meeting with General Secretary Gorbachev in Geneva and my hopes for a better relationship between our two governments. Your leaders can...
It had been 6 years since leaders had faced each other across a table, and thousands of nuclear warheads had been deployed by both sides.
Their attitudes were frozen, the politics were frozen, the places were frozen. And suddenly with Gorbachev, you got this thaw and things started moving.
Reagan proposed the summit and Gorbachev accepted. And in fact, the letters between Gorbachev and Reagan are an incredible source for understanding the end of the Cold War. Because in those letters from the very beginning, Reagan is writing about the evil of nuclear weapons, about his abolitionist ideas, and about necessity for dialogue.
A nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought.
After years of harsh rhetoric, proxy wars, threats, mistakes, and a significant buildup in nuclear arms, the world breathed a collective sigh of relief as Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev shook hands for the first time in Geneva.
Each came across to the other as somewhat stubborn. In particular, Gorbachev wanted to kill the Strategic Defense Initiative, which Reagan felt was essential.
Their first conversation, it started like an ideological confrontation, but it ended like a conversation of two human beings.
Reagan would always stress what is going to be good for the Russian people. And there was this very human dimension of his negotiating strategy. He was fortunate to have opposite at the table Gorbachev.
The details, such as which missiles to eliminate, were difficult to navigate. It would take time.
They both were, some would say, dreamers. They both thought these weapons are inhumane, unusable, and mankind had to eliminate them and had to find a way to eliminate them.
Would another president have tried to reach out to Gorbachev? Probably. Would another president have said, let's do away with all nuclear weapons? Probably not. Because very few presidents harbor that apocalyptic view that Reagan had inherited.
Among the most important outcomes of the Geneva Summit was a mutual desire to meet again.
I can't claim that we had a meeting of the minds on such fundamentals as ideology or national purpose. But we understand each other better, and that's a key to peace. I gained a better...
I think it had also another significant element. It was the passage from the stage of what you would call the megaphone diplomacy to the conversation diplomacy.
Now after Geneva, after this program, we know even if we disarm completely, they're not gonna attack us. There is no more talk about first strike from the United States, and therefore you can go for really deep disarmament, which is what Gorbachev wanted anyway, to fix the economy and to end the Cold War.
Just 4 days after leaving Geneva, President Reagan was informed by Deputy National Security Advisor John Poindexter that the first shipment of Hawk missiles had arrived in Iran. The scope of the three-way deal was growing, along with the consequences. Despite later denials, several members of the Reagan team knew about the arms for hostages deal. McFarlane was the negotiator, but Defense Secretary Caspar Weinberger had to authorize the weapons shipments. Weinberger had told investigators from the FBI that he rarely kept notes or a diary. However, during investigations after Weinberger and Reagan had left office, independent counsel Lawrence Walsh and his team uncovered thousands of pages of Weinberger's notes and diary entries in storage at the Library of Congress. Weinberger wrote about a meeting with President Reagan and others on December 7, 1985. I argued strongly that we have an embargo that makes arms sales to Iran illegal. Plus, President couldn't violate it. Plus, washing transaction through Israel wouldn't make it legal. Schultz, Don Regan agreed. President said he could answer charges of illegality, but he couldn't answer charge that, quote, big strong President Reagan passed up a chance to free hostages. The national security team was divided. McFarlane had been involved from the beginning, but he eventually abandoned the plan.
The error, among several, was to imagine that you could do this with so few American resources involved, not really supported by the cabinet level of the government or any financial or other resources. So it was a misguided idea, not in its goal and purpose, but, and I explained that to the president. I resigned from the administration.
According to McFarlane, he resigned in part because the deal failed to deliver the release of all of the American hostages being held in Lebanon.
But I fought myself about it because I feared that the president's very genuine concern for the hostages was going to lead him to keep going in some fashion.
And the administration did continue. The deal was no longer about facilitating regime change in Iran. It was about trading arms for hostages. Legal or not, it wasn't working.
I learned before long that indeed it was still going on, and I received communications from people on the NSC staff and my successor, John Poindexter, that it was still supported by the president.
Before Washington and Moscow could resume nuclear arms talks, the Soviets fell victim to a catastrophic explosion at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. Many died. Tens of thousands were exposed to radiation and forced to relocate, and the area remains contaminated today.
I would say that Chernobyl catastrophe paradoxically moved Gorbachev closer to Ronald Reagan.
What became clear was that you didn't even need to use nuclear weapons to devastate a country. World War II bombs on a nuclear power plant could destroy the whole region from the fallout.
The crisis at Chernobyl was costly. Soviet resources had been drained by their failed war in Afghanistan, and many in the United States believed the Soviet economy was vulnerable.
By 1985, you had to stand in line to buy anything. But in terms of military production, in terms of defense budget, it did not have any slowdown at all.
Cutting military production would take time, but Gorbachev made many changes at home that could not have been imagined before he entered office.
Perestroika means restructuring, and it meant restructuring the economy. Glasnost meant openness, and glasnost is really what clicked with people. The society was so closed and so secretive, and suddenly they were telling you, from the TV, from the newspapers, Pravda was writing about it. You can't discuss anything.
In Gorbachev's mind, the reform that he was bringing was supposed to make his country more modern and competitive in order to be equal partner of the rest of the world.
As Moscow engaged in new policies of openness, Washington was enmeshed in secrecy. Neither Congress nor the public was yet aware that the administration was trading arms for hostages with Iran. And questions about the CIA's role in Central America surfaced when the Nicaraguan military shot down a cargo plane they claimed was being used to resupply the Contras. The lone survivor, American Eugene Hasenfuss, initially told Nicaraguan authorities that he was part of a CIA-authorized operation. The president disagreed.
while they may be American citizens, there is no government connection with that at all.
A later congressional investigation determined that the operation to resupply the Contras was covert and had been sponsored by elements of the U.S. government. Secrecy may have shrouded policies in the Middle East and Central America, but the public was very much aware of the second Reagan-Gorbachev summit taking place in the tiny nation of Iceland. Gorbachev arrived in Reykjavik with more than just a desire to roll back the arms race. He hoped the summit would have a positive impact on the domestic challenges he faced, pushing glasnost and perestroika.
And in order to be able to attack the challenge of the transformation and the demolition of the Stalinist system in the Soviet Union, he had to produce results on the foreign policy front.
The General Secretary abandoned previous Soviet tactics.
And Gorbachev came right at the beginning, basically proposing from the Soviet side all of the positions that we had been battling for. It was breathtaking.
The Soviet discussions before Reykjavik are fascinating because Gorbachev says our ultimate goal is elimination of nuclear weapons. To achieve that, we will make major concessions.
Gorbachev comes with a package for everything, which would be a 50% reduction of everything in 5 years, and then an elimination in another 5 years, provided that research for defensive systems were kept in laboratories, that is, not tested, for at least 10 years.
It's better than any suspense novel you can read. It's so emotional. They come so close to actually agreeing on abolishing nuclear weapons. And Reagan cannot give up SDI for many reasons.
Reagan was extremely disappointed, and he says in his diary he was also angry, because at that time he felt he had been lured to Reykjavik just to kill SDI.
If you look at the photos of them at the beginning of the negotiations, they are so beaming. They wanted this meeting. They like each other. And then they come out and they're stricken. Their faces are they're just stricken. They are leaving, both so disillusioned.
We are deeply disappointed at this outcome.
But Gorbachev suddenly realizes that they did not achieve it, but they touched it. They were so close that it's possible. And because it's possible, it's not a failure, it's actually a breakthrough.
And it was this internal feeling, a psychological feature, which allowed him very quickly after Reykjavik to untie the package of his proposals and to ignore practically the SDI, to behave as if it never existed.
But the substance of what they had agreed upon, these were the most sweeping and widespread agreements that had ever been made, not only between the US and the Soviet Union, but between any two countries.
Still, some of America's staunchest allies echoed comments reminiscent of détente.
Margaret Thatcher flies to Washington and she blasts Reagan, who's an old friend. And she says, this is crazy. Nuclear weapons kept peace. Our whole strategies are based on nuclear weapons, deterrence, stability in Europe, everything. There is a conventional superiority of the Soviets. What are you going to do if you abolish nuclear weapons?
I had the honor of interviewing Margaret Thatcher at the British Embassy here in Washington. She was still mad. Mad. I don't mean irritated, I mean angry.
Despite the subdued U.S. reaction to the summit and criticism from supporters, the Reagan team believed progress had been made.
We have it within our grasp to move speedily with the Soviets toward even more breakthroughs. Our ideas are out there on the table. They won't go away.
Just 2 weeks after returning from Reykjavik, an additional 500 TOW missiles were sent to Iran. A few days later, American hostage David Jacobson was released from captivity in Beirut. The next day, a Lebanese magazine called Al-Shura broke one of the biggest stories of Reagan's presidency. the United States was selling arms to Iran in exchange for the release of American hostages.
Firsthand about our dealings with Iran.
The story had legs, and just 10 days later, the president shared both details and denials with the American people.
The charge has been made that the United States has shipped weapons to Iran as ransom payment for the release of American hostages in Lebanon.
After denying that weapons were being sold to obtain the release of hostages, President Reagan summarized his policy.
Our government has a firm policy not to capitulate to terrorist demands, that no concessions policy remains in force. In spite of the wildly speculative and false stories about arms for hostages and alleged ransom payments, we did not, repeat, did not trade weapons or anything else for hostages, nor will we.
A week after the president's speech, then Attorney General and longtime Reagan friend Ed Meese began an investigation into the arms for hostages deal. The wall of secrecy unraveled quickly. 3 days after the investigation began, Attorney General Meese advised the president that up to $30 million from the arms sales to Iran had been funneled to Contra forces in Central America. The deal was outlined in what Meese called a diversion memo, authored by National Security Council staff member Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North. What had been termed the arms for hostages deal was now being called the Iran-Contra Affair.
You know, selling weapons to Iran, which had held Americans hostage at the embassy, in order to fund the Contras, a group in Nicaragua, in contravention of at least two laws. It's a pretty big scandal.
Before accepting the resignation of John Poindexter, Reagan fired his assistant, Oliver North. The president also created the Tower Commission to investigate the role of the National Security Council. Former Republican Senator John Tower led the commission. A criminal investigation was launched roughly 2 weeks later, headed by Special Prosecutor Lawrence Walsh. As questions grew about the role of the president, his approval rating suffered the worst one-month drop in U.S. history.
There's a big debate about whether or not Reagan knew any of this. There's no evidence that he knew the details, or there's not firm evidence. But he did say to his aides, keep the Contras together, body and soul. And so that's what people did.
But I pledge to you, I will set things right. If illegal acts were undertaken in the implementation of our policy, those who did so will be brought to justice.
The president tried to convince the public, but many Americans were uncertain.
There's still a lot of unanswered questions.
I think he did what he has to know.
I thought it was an honest effort to come clean.
He wasn't watching what he was supposed to be watching all along, and I can't forget that.
When he testified before a meeting of the Tower Commission, the president said he had authorized the first shipment of TOW missiles from Israel to Iran in 1985. 16 days later, before the same commission, Reagan retracted his earlier statement, claiming he didn't know about the arms shipment. The president appeared confused during the interview, leading to media speculation that he might be tired or suffering from a failing memory.
Was he confused? Yes, he was confused. Was he an older man? Yes, he was an older man by that stage. All that is true. Was he lying? To me, I just have to tell you, as somebody who worked with the man, that is not just unlikely, but unthinkable. Unthinkable.
In his book, Special Trust, Robert McFarlane maintains a loyalty to the president. He explains Reagan's Tower Commission testimony by saying, Reagan, after first supporting me on his approval of the Israeli shipments, was soon convinced by Chief of Staff Don Regan and White House counsel Peter Wallison that he hadn't approved them. In a February 20th letter to the Tower Commission, Reagan offered a different explanation, saying, "The simple truth is, I don't remember, period." Although highly critical, the Tower Commission report drew few hard conclusions. But they did say, quote, even if Mr. McFarlane did not have the president's explicit prior approval, he clearly had his full support. Many questions remain. Before Congress began an investigation of its own, the president addressed the nation.
A few months ago, I told the American people I did not trade arms for hostages. My heart and my best intentions still tell me that's true, but the facts and the evidence tell me it is not. There are reasons why it happened, but no excuses. It was a mistake. I did approve it. I just can't say specifically when.
That's a moment that I will always remember, Ronald Reagan. It almost brought his presidency down.
The president's approval rating had slipped dramatically during the scandal. Trust in the White House was in question, and key staffers, including Chief of Staff Don Regan and CIA Director William Casey, lost their jobs.
The polls began to show that for the first time, people didn't trust him. I don't think he felt that he'd done anything wrong. But what I always felt hurt him, and it did hurt him, it was almost like a physical pain, was that he lost the American people.
There was little time to feel the pain as the U.S. was drawn once again into the war between Iran and Iraq. Tensions were high in the Persian Gulf, and with Iran-Contra now public, U.S. alliances to either side were shaky at best. 37 U.S. sailors were killed when their missile frigate, the USS Stark, came under attack by a French-built Iraqi military jet. Iraqi President Saddam Hussein later apologized for what he called an unintentional incident.
The mission of the men of the USS Stark, safeguarding the interests of the United States and the free world in the Gulf, remains crucial to our national security and to the security of our friends throughout the world.
During the final months of his presidency, Ronald Reagan returned his focus to the old foe he found familiar, the Soviet Union. As Congress and the Independent Council continued their investigations, the president journeyed to Berlin and the fabled Brandenburg Gate.
In 1987, Berlin was celebrating the 750th anniversary of the founding of the city. The White House decided that it was a good time for Reagan to go to Berlin and make a speech there.
The same man who weeks earlier had looked tired and forgetful returned to his rhetorical roots, offering an historic challenge.
If you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
To the Germans, the important historic symbol was the Brandenburg Gate. To the Americans, the Berlin Wall. But was a way of putting down a marker. Are you serious? Do you mean it? To Gorbachev.
Reagan, from the start, believed that it was not just about arms control. It wasn't just about signing agreements with the Soviets. The Soviets really had to change conditions and change the way in which they governed this huge part of Eastern Central Europe and their own country.
The president made the decision to speak directly to General Secretary Gorbachev. Today, the speech remains one of Reagan's most talked about, but with no clear consensus on its relevance.
That speech was a long time ago now, and all my life since, I've had it some place in the back of my mind, it's never left my mind, the question, what difference did it make? Did it have any effect?
We also know from later documents that it had absolutely no impact on anything. It was seen in the Soviet Union as purely a propaganda move.
I don't believe that the Berlin Wall came down because of this speech, but I do think that the speech was part of a context and part of a relationship that Reagan and Gorbachev had developed, in which they essentially were spelling out the conditions under which the Cold War would end.
Gorbachev knew life was better in the West, and less than 2 weeks after Reagan's speech, he convinced his own Communist Party to pursue a policy of economic, social, and political reconstruction. As the president prepared for another Soviet-American summit in Washington, the joint congressional committees issued their final report on the Iran-Contra Affair.
We conclude that he created, or at least tolerated, an environment where an illegal diversion of funds to the Contras was viewed as consistent with his policies.
Despite objections from some Republicans, it concluded that the ultimate responsibility for the events in the Iran-Contra Affair must rest with the president. Criminal charges for many of those involved were still months away. Good news on Soviet-American relations continued to play to the president's strengths as General Secretary Gorbachev made his first visit to the United States.
This summit has lit the sky with hope for all people of goodwill.
Old tensions between the two leaders had turned to smiles when they signed the INF Treaty, jointly eliminating more than 2,500 short, medium, and intermediate-range missiles. But not everyone was happy.
The extreme right of the Republican Party began, in his last year to say he's gone soft and so on. There were actually 5 or 6 Republican votes against the INF Treaty.
Many conservative allies felt the INF Treaty set a dangerous precedent.
Lots of people, including people in the CIA, thought we were all wrong and almost to the end opposed the efforts that President Reagan was making with the Soviet Union.
There were a lot of conservatives who thought Reagan had lost his mind, that he didn't know what was going on. And if you look back, Reagan and the people closest to him made the right call. They were right. The skeptics were wrong.
It was over 6 years ago, November 18, 1981, when I first proposed what would come to be called the zero option. It was a simple proposal, but with patience, determination, and commitment, we've made this impossible vision a reality.
Once change began, it happened quickly for both nations, especially for the Soviets. Opposition from within, led by Poland and Czechoslovakia, was having an impact in Moscow. Their long Soviet war with Afghanistan had been costly, and Gorbachev called for an end to the fighting. The U.S. agreed to pull back on its support for the Soviet enemy, the Mujahideen. But front pages in the U.S. were dominated by criminal indictments in the Iran-Contra Affair. Former National Security Advisor John Poindexter, Oliver North, and 2 colleagues were charged with numerous felonies for their role in illegally funding Nicaraguan Contras with funds derived from arms sales to Iran. And as lawyers for the accused mounted their defense, President Reagan made his first visit to Moscow. Their 4th summit included both arms talks and a renewed push by Reagan for the Soviets to embrace human rights. The openness policies of glasnost were affirmed when Reagan met directly with Soviet dissidents.
The United States views human rights as fundamental, absolutely fundamental to our relationship with the Soviet Union and all nations.
The president also spoke to students in a lecture at Moscow State University.
But progress is not foreordained. The key is freedom. Freedom of thought, freedom of information, freedom of communication.
Nobody spoke about human rights. Nobody. And what struck me is how confidently, simply, humanly he addressed all these issues.
And in a sign that the Cold War really was drawing to a close, Reagan and Gorbachev walked together in Moscow's Red Square. It had been 5 years since the president had called the Soviet Union an evil empire. Things had changed.
I was talking about another time, another era.
The president also credited Gorbachev during his press conference from Moscow.
No, I think that a great deal of it is due to the General Secretary, who I have found different than previous Soviet leaders have been.
The Cold War was settled by negotiation to the interests of both parties. The idea that this was a victory is absurd. Gorbachev defeated communism in the Soviet Union, not Reagan and the United States. Reagan and Gorbachev made it possible for him to try to reform.
But history 100, 200 years from now will see really Gorbachev as a linchpin of the revolution of 1989, and that he worked with other people to accomplish it, like Reagan, like George Herbert Walker Bush, like Pope John Paul II, like Chancellor Kohl.
Reagan himself never said we won the Cold War in the sense of a victory over the Soviet Union. He said our ideas won, yes, but it wasn't a military victory. Gorbachev began to implement our values and political ideals and tried to turn his own system to it. And the end of the Cold War gave him the opportunity to do that.
Shortly after his return from Moscow, the president's holiday vacation was interrupted by a civilian tragedy in the Middle East. An Iranian commercial jetliner flying over the Persian Gulf was shot down by the U.S. Navy. Combat teams from the USS Vincennes had been on heightened alert since the attack on the USS Stark. Commanders believed the airliner, Iran Air Flight 655, was an Iranian F-14 fighter jet poised for attack. In an event eerily similar to the Soviet downing of KAL-007 nearly 5 years earlier, 290 civilians were killed on what Iran claimed was a routine commercial flight to Dubai. Despite outrage from Iran, there was little reaction in the United States.
I accept your nomination for president.
And with the nomination of George Herbert Walker Bush as the next Republican candidate for president, Ronald Reagan's two-term tenure as president was winding down. Like most presidents, the measure of Ronald Reagan's success or failure in foreign policy can only be assessed over time. He ran for president pushing domestic policy. But global events and new leadership in Moscow created both challenges and opportunities. And today, many would argue that his greatest achievement came in foreign policy as he helped bring an end to the Cold War. The president made the point himself during a farewell address to the nation.
Not only have the superpowers actually begun to reduce their stockpiles of nuclear weapons, and hope for even more progress is bright, but the regional conflicts that rack the globe are also beginning to cease.
History will decide how much credit to give the Reagan team, but few will question their commitment or the positive direction the U.S. and Soviet Union were headed as Reagan left office.
We meant to change a nation, and instead, we changed a world.
While closely linked to the end of the Cold War, the outcome of Reagan's policies in Central America was strongly influenced by leaders in the region. After negotiating a 5-nation peace accord, Costa Rican President Oscar Arias was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts to stop the fighting.
Teníamos nuestras discrepancias, nuestras divergencias.
We had our differences, but looking ourselves in the eyes, we had the courage to come to an agreement for the good of 40 million Central Americans.
the long-term impact of Reagan policies in the Middle East is still playing out. The president's decision to pull back American forces following terrorist attacks on both the U.S. Embassy and Marine barracks in Lebanon remains controversial. Hezbollah, which came to power during the Lebanese Civil War, has gained significant political and social influence in the region. When Ronald Reagan was sworn into office, 52 American hostages held in Tehran were released by their Iranian captors. 8 years later, America's relationship with Iran remained at a standoff. The U.S. role in the Iran-Iraq War and the White House decision to deal arms for hostages had, in some minds, made the situation worse. Of the Americans taken hostage in Lebanon, only 3 were released as part of the arms for hostages deal. 2 were found dead. During the same period, several additional Americans were taken hostage before the last arms shipment to Iran was made in October 1986. SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative, played a significant role in Reagan's Cold War policy. The system was never completed. Approximately $40 billion was spent on SDI before the program was eliminated in 1993. Just 10 months after George H.W. Bush was sworn in as Reagan's successor, the longtime symbol of the Cold War crumbled under growing political unrest from Moscow's allies throughout the Eastern Bloc. The Berlin Wall had kept East Germans inside their own border for nearly 30 years. Hundreds had died trying to escape. But in the end, Germans on both sides of the wall used their bare hands to reunite East and West.
This is the first peaceful democratic revolution on German soil. And in some ways we owe it to the Poles, we owe it to Gorbachev, and we owe it to Ronald Reagan.
One of the myths later is that the speech brought down the wall. The wall was brought down by the Germans and the Czechs and the Hungarians and by the Soviet tolerance and openness.
The Cold War had already ended, ideologically and politically. It was not the speech that brought it down, it was the change in Gorbachev's policies, which continued into the Bush administration because we began to negotiate things without the polemics.
Determining the final outcome of the Iran-Contra Affair took years. Before leaving office in 1993, President Bush issued pardons to 6 members of Reagan's administration, including former Defense Secretary Caspar Weinberger. After a 7-year investigation into the Reagan White House, Special Prosecutor Lawrence Walsh concluded that President Reagan's conduct fell well short of criminality which could be successfully prosecuted. But Walsh also concluded that President Reagan created the conditions which made possible the crimes committed by others. A few months after release of the Walsh Report, Ronald Reagan published a letter to the American people acknowledging that he suffered from Alzheimer's disease. He lived his final years in retirement with his wife Nancy at their California home. Ronald Reagan died on June 5, 2004.
If Ronald Reagan...
Leaders from around the world attended his funeral at Washington's National Cathedral, including his former adversary, Mikhail Gorbachev.
Nancy was there for him always.
While scholars may take sharply different views on his legacy, few would dispute Ronald Reagan's impact on contemporary political debate.
He began realigning the American electorate around conservative principles. The idea that America is a country that should embody freedom, liberty, democracy, equality, all of those things, that they're central to the American fabric, that America is much more of an idea than it is a set of institutions, or brick and mortar.
When it came to principle, Ronald Reagan believed that you had to do what was right. And that's why we remember him, and that's why he achieved what he did.
Ronald Reagan, as brilliant a politician as ever walked the planet, persuaded people that big government was the one ruining their lives. That was such an amazing political sleight of hand, and it has stuck. It has stuck, and it's conceivable that it will destroy the American government.
Are there long-term problems with Reagan policies? Yes, we're seeing them in the misreading of Reagan in the 21st century. But as we get further away from Reagan, 50, 100 years from now, he's going to be seen not quite as politically powerful as his ghost is right now, but will be seen as a top 10 American president.
Throughout his presidency, Ronald Reagan shared his belief that America was a beacon to the world, a shining city on a hill. He made the reference a final time when evaluating his 8 years in office.
My friends, we did it. We weren't just marking time. We made a difference. We made the city stronger, we made the city freer, and we left her in good hands. All in all, not bad. Not bad at all.